My mother handed my sister a brand new Range Rover and my brother-in-law a watch that cost more than most people's annual salary, while I sat at the far end of the table holding an invoice for my own Christmas dinner. When she finally slid that envelope across the mahogany toward me, she didn't even look up from her champagne glass. She just said, quietly, "The way you tell someone their parking meter expired, this is what makes sense for your situation." I didn't cry. I didn't throw my napkin down and walk out into the snow. I just smiled, reached for my phone, and transferred the full amount before the ice in her glass had time to melt. Because what my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they'd been dismissing for 6 years had spent those 6 years buying companies. Quietly, methodically. And now, without any of them realizing it, I had bought theirs. My name is Emma Reed. I'm 34 years old. And for the last 6 years, my family has believed I was the failure. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The drive from Denver to Aspen takes about 4 hours in good weather. In a December blizzard, it takes 6. And every mile of it gives you time to think about why you're making the trip at all. I'd asked myself that question somewhere around Glenwood Canyon, watching the snow accumulate on the canyon walls, the Colorado River running dark and fast below the highway. The answer I kept arriving at wasn't a comfortable one. I wasn't going because I wanted to. I was going because my father had built something with his hands and his years, and someone needed to be in that house who actually understood what he'd left behind. I pulled up to the chalet at 5:40 in the evening, 20 minutes early. The building rose out of the mountain like it had always been there, all timber and glass and warm amber light spilling across the fresh snow. $12 million of architecture in a zip code that treated $12 million as a starting point. I sat in my car for a moment before going in. I was wearing a navy sweater I'd bought online for $38. My coat was 3 winters old. My boots were waterproof and practical and deeply, aggressively unfashionable. I'd packed 1 small rolling suitcase and 1 black box, unribboned, unlabeled, which I intended to place under the Christmas tree and say very little about. I wasn't dressed this way because I couldn't afford otherwise. I was dressed this way because I had learned, a long time ago, that the most dangerous thing you can do in a negotiation is let the other side know what you're holding. I grabbed my bag, tucked the black box under my arm, and walked to the front door. The moment Julia Reed opened it, she scanned me the way a customs officer scans a suspicious carry-on, top to bottom, efficient, already forming conclusions. "You're early," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." She stepped back to let me in, and as I crossed the threshold, she reached out and briefly touched my arm. It looked like warmth. It felt like a warning. And then she leaned close and said, low enough that only I could hear, "Please don't make things difficult tonight." I smiled and said, "Of course not." I meant it too, just not in the way she intended. Inside, the chalet was everything Julia Reed believed a home should be, a cathedral to the idea that taste and money were the same thing. The ceilings were vaulted pine, hung with a chandelier made of elk antlers and Edison bulbs. A 12-foot Christmas tree stood in the great room, decorated in gold and ivory, with ornaments I recognized from our childhood, though they'd been quietly replaced over the years with more expensive versions of themselves, the way Julia tended to replace things that reminded her of when the family had less. A fire roared in the stone hearth. The room smelled of Douglas fir and roasting duck and a candle that I was fairly sure cost $200 and claimed to smell like alpine air, which, standing in actual alpine air, struck me as optimistic. I set my suitcase by the staircase. I carried the black box to the Christmas tree and tucked it near the back, behind a cluster of silver-wrapped gifts with elaborate bows. No one paid attention to it. That was fine. No one was supposed to. Not yet. Miley arrived 20 minutes later in a performance of an entrance. She came through the door in a cloud of cold air and Chanel No. 5, her blonde hair blown out to a perfection that required either an hour of effort or a very good stylist. Probably both. She was wearing a blush pink Valentino dress that was technically appropriate for a family Christmas dinner and practically designed to remind everyone in the room that she had the kind of life where Valentino was appropriate for a family Christmas dinner. She hugged our mother first, long and theatrical. Then she spotted me across the room and offered a smile that was warm in the way that winter sunlight is warm. Visible, but not quite reaching you. "Emma." She crossed the room and briefly touched both my arms, European style. "You made it." I made it. "How was the drive?" Long. You should have flown. Logan got us a private charter. It takes 40 minutes. And she said this the way people say things they believe are helpful. I keep telling you, it changes your life. I'll keep that in mind. Logan Harlow appeared behind her, and even if I hadn't known anything about him, I think I would have disliked him on instinct. He had the particular posture of a man who had decided, somewhere in his mid-30s, that confidence and condescension were the same thing. He was handsome in a deliberate way, jaw sharp, shoulders squared, wearing a charcoal Armani suit that was slightly too formal for a family dinner and perfectly calibrated to make everyone aware of it. On his left wrist, catching the firelight, was a brand new Patek Philippe, stainless steel, reference 5711. I knew the reference number because I had once considered buying one as a gift for a business partner and had ultimately decided against it on the grounds that it was the kind of watch that announced itself too loudly. He looked at me, did a quick and not very subtle assessment, and extended his hand. Emma, good to see you. You too, Logan. He held the handshake a beat too long, the way people do when they want you to know they're not intimidated. Then he turned away to pour himself a drink, and I was, once again, part of the background. I found a chair near the window, slightly removed from the main gathering, and I sat down. I ordered myself a sparkling water. I watched. There's a particular skill that comes from years of being underestimated. You become a very good observer. When people don't expect anything from you, they stop performing for you. They stop filtering. You see things they'd never show someone they considered a threat. What I saw, that first hour before dinner, I saw Logan check his phone 11 times in 40 minutes, always angling the screen away from Miley. I saw the particular quality of his laughter, which was loud and slightly too frequent, the laughter of someone filling silence they're afraid of. I saw him pour his second drink before the first one was half finished. I saw my mother orbit him like he was a sun she needed to stay warm. She touched his arm when she laughed. She deferred to him when anyone asked a question about the family business. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had decided this man was the solution to a problem she couldn't name. I saw Miley watching herself in the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling window, adjusting her hair, satisfied with what she saw. And I saw the black box, sitting quietly at the back of the Christmas tree, patient as a secret. Dinner was served at 7. The table was set with the kind of precision that suggests someone spent the afternoon with a ruler. Crystal glasses aligned to the millimeter, napkins folded into swans, name cards in silver holders. My place card was at the far end of the table, separated from the main cluster of seating by an unoccupied chair that I gradually understood was simply a buffer. The food was extraordinary. Julia had hired a private chef for the week, a young man from Vail who worked in silence and produced course after course of things I recognized from restaurant menus I'd studied during business dinners. Duck confit with cherry reduction, truffle risotto, a cheese course with accompaniments I couldn't identify. I ate slowly and said very little. Julia sat at the head of the table and held court, a skill she had refined over 40 years of social performance. She asked Logan about the hotels. She asked Miley about her followers, her brand partnerships, her plans for a product line she'd been discussing since spring. She asked about Jack, their 2-year-old son, who was asleep upstairs in the care of a nanny Julia had hired for the week because children need a consistent sleep schedule and holiday chaos isn't good for their nervous systems. She did not ask me anything. At one point, there was a lull and I said something, a comment about a piece of news I'd read, something oblique about commercial real estate trends in mountain markets. It was the kind of thing I'd normally say to a colleague. It landed on the table and sat there. Logan glanced at me and then at Julia with a small, patient smile. The smile of a teacher waiting for the confused student to finish speaking. "That's an interesting take," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Miley had her phone out under the table. Julia refilled her champagne. The conversation moved on. I cut a piece of duck and chewed it slowly and thought, let them have tonight. Tomorrow starts early. The gift exchange began after dessert, when the fire had burned down to a steady amber and the room smelled of cognac and melting wax. Julia stood and moved to the Christmas tree with the air of someone who has rehearsed this moment, because she had. My mother was many things, but she was never unscripted. Every gesture, every pause, every inflection had been considered in advance. Performing generosity was something she took seriously because it was, at its core, a form of power. She reached beneath the tree and produced a flat, heavy box wrapped in dark green paper with a gold ribbon. "For Logan," she announced. He opened it with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who has received expensive things before and knows how to receive them gracefully. Inside, cradled in black velvet, was the watch. Not a Patek Philippe, he was already wearing that one. This was an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, the slate dial version, newly released. I knew the retail price. I also knew what it meant that Julia had been able to acquire it, because that reference was waitlisted everywhere. Logan lifted it from the box and turned it in the firelight, and I watched his face do something I hadn't seen it do all evening, something genuine. His composure softened for a moment, something almost like gratitude. "Julia," he said, "this is incredible." "You've earned it," she said, and she said it the way she said everything she meant, simply, without decoration. "You've kept this family's name standing. That matters." He put the watch on the table beside his plate. He already had one on his wrist. He would wear this one tomorrow. Then came Miley's gift. Julia produced a small envelope, the kind that holds a key card or a gift card or, as it turned out, a car key fob. She walked it to her younger daughter with the same ceremony she'd shown Logan, but with something warmer underneath it, something maternal in the old-fashioned sense, the look of a mother surveying a daughter who has met her expectations. Miley opened the envelope, saw the logo on the fob, screamed, a short, sharp, genuinely delighted scream, and jumped up from her chair. "A Range Rover?" "The Sport, in Portofino blue. It's in the heated garage." Julia smiled. "You deserve something that could handle the mountain roads." Miley threw her arms around her mother. Logan applauded. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched. The room settled back into its candlelit warmth. The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the glass. And then Julia turned to me. She didn't go back to the tree. Instead, she reached beneath the table, into her chair, where she'd apparently kept it, separate from the other gifts, as though it occupied a different category entirely. She produced an envelope, white, business-sized, the kind of envelope that contains a utility bill or a jury summons or information you didn't ask for and don't want. She walked the length of the table towards me, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone knows something is about to happen and no one wants to be the first to look away. She set it on the table in front of my empty dessert plate. She stepped back. She said, "Open it." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my mother. Her expression was composed, vaguely sympathetic, the expression of a doctor delivering a difficult but necessary diagnosis. I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Julia Reed's personal letterhead, the cream-colored stock she used for correspondence she considered official. At the top, in the centered bold font of a business document, holiday expense summary, family cost-sharing line items neatly organized, accommodation, guest suite, market rate equivalent, 3 nights, $450 meals and provisions, estimated per person share 3 days, $380 airport transport Aspen/Pitkin round trip, $120, total due $950, and at the bottom, in a smaller font that I knew Julia had considered carefully, families support one another. This is one way you can contribute. I set the paper down on the table. I was aware of the silence. I was aware of Miley already reaching for her phone. I was aware of Logan watching me with the particular interest of someone who has arranged a situation and wants to observe the result. I felt the heat rise in my face, not humiliation, though they were all waiting for that. Something colder, more precise. $950 for the privilege of sitting at this table, in this house, in this family. While Miley had a new car and Logan had a watch I could identify by reference number. I took a breath. I picked up my phone. I opened my banking app, the basic one, the one linked to the account my family knew about. The account that, as far as they were concerned, represented the full picture of my financial situation. The balance read $3,247. I navigated to the transfer screen. I typed in my mother's email address. I had it memorized. I entered the amount, $950. I hit send. The room was quiet enough that we all heard it, the soft chime from Julia's handbag on the floor beside her chair. She looked down, startled, then reached for her phone with the slow, careful movements of someone who wasn't sure what they were about to find. She stared at the screen. "She paid it," Julia said. Not to anyone in particular, just the fact of it, landing in the air like something dropped. Miley lowered her own phone halfway. She actually... Wait, what? She had $900? $950, I said. And yes. Logan recovered first. He was good at recovering. He leaned back in his chair with the patient smile of someone adjusting a narrative midstream. She's probably overdrafted. Those transfers can take a day or two to bounce. The confirmation is already in my inbox, Julia said, still looking at her phone. I set mine face down on the table. Thank you for dinner, I said. I believe I've just purchased my share of it. The silence stretched. Miley was the one who broke it. She looked at the invoice still lying on the table in front of me, then at my sweater, then at the camera on her phone, and something lit up behind her eyes. Not malice exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of content. She lifted the phone and tapped the screen. Okay, I'm live, she said brightly, shifting into the voice she used for her 80,000 followers. A register that was approximately 30% higher than her normal speaking voice and carried a studied breathlessness, like everything she was about to say had just occurred to her. Guys, you are not going to believe what is happening right now. My sister just got handed a bill for Christmas dinner, like an actual invoice, and she just Venmo'd my mom for it. She panned the camera across the table, capturing the candlelight and the crystal and the remnants of the meal. Then she turned it toward me. Can we talk about this sweater, though? She zoomed in. I think this is from like 4 seasons ago. It's genuinely pilling at the elbow. Emma, no judgment, but help. Logan leaned into frame and addressed the camera with the ease of a man who considered himself naturally watchable. Sometimes the most loving thing a family can do is model financial accountability, he said. We're actually doing Emma a favor. We're so supportive, Miley agreed, turning the camera back on herself. It's literally about helping her grow. I watched them perform. I did not say anything. I did not throw my wine. I reached down beside my chair and picked up the black box I'd brought in from the car that afternoon, the one I'd placed beneath the tree when I arrived. I'd retrieved it quietly during dessert, tucking it beside my feet while no one was paying attention. I placed it in the center of the table. It sat there. Matte black, no ribbon, no label. Stark against the candlelight and crystal. It looked less like a Christmas gift and more like a statement. I also have something, I said, for everyone. Miley lowered her phone slightly. Logan looked at the box with the expression of someone who had already assessed its value and found it wanting. What is it? Miley asked. It's not to be opened tonight, I said, or tomorrow. This box stays closed until the evening of December 27th. That's the condition. If anyone opens it before then, it becomes void. Miley stared. That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. Why? Because that's when it should be opened. Logan reached out and lifted the box, shook it once beside his ear. It made no sound. He set it down with a small, dismissive breath. Is this a bit? He said. Like a performance art situation? It's a gift, I said, with a condition. The condition is December 27th. Julia had been watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. Now she stood, crossed to the tree, picked up the black box with 2 fingers, the way you'd handle something of uncertain cleanliness, and tucked it at the very back, behind the Hermes boxes and the gift baskets. Fine, she said. December 27th. She dusted her hands together lightly. It'll give you something to look forward to. She sat back down. I looked at the tree, at the dark corner where the box had disappeared among shinier things. I looked at my mother. I picked up my fork. They left for the spa at 9:15. I knew about the spa package because Julia had mentioned it 3 times since I'd arrived. The Alpine Sanctuary Resort, the Platinum Renewal Treatment, the heated mineral pools, the fact that she'd been on the wait list since October. She said it with the mild self-congratulation of someone who has arranged something difficult, which was the way she talked about most things she'd arranged. What she had not mentioned, until she was standing in the entryway in her cashmere wrap coat with her overnight bag over her shoulder, was that the package was for 4 people. 4? I said. It's a family suite package. She checked her reflection in the entry mirror, adjusting an earring. The reservation is under 4 names. Logan, myself, Miley, and Jack. I looked at her. Jack is 2 years old. The mineral pools are therapeutic for children. The resort is very accommodating. So the 2-year-old has a spot and I don't. Miley appeared at the top of the stairs in a different outfit than she'd worn to dinner. A cream silk set, luggage over her shoulder. The nanny's putting Jack to sleep now, she said, as if this clarified something. We'll pick him up in the morning. Logan came last, coat already on, keys in hand. He stopped when he saw me still standing there. You're not coming, he said. It wasn't a question. Apparently not. He looked at Julia. Something passed between them, a flicker of communication I wasn't meant to read, though I read it anyway. Then he looked back at me and gestured toward the dining room, where the remains of dinner were still spread across the table. "The cleaning staff doesn't come until tomorrow morning," he said. "It would be great if someone could take care of all that." I looked at the table. 8 place settings, crystal glasses with wine rings, serving dishes with congealed duck fat. "Of course," I said. "Great." He smiled, the smile of a man who has never washed a dish in the presence of someone who might remember it. There's a good podcast if you need something to listen to. They filed out the door. Cold air flooded the entryway. The door clicked shut. The chalet went silent. I stood alone in the great room for a long moment. The fire had burned lower, casting the room in deep amber shadow. The Christmas tree lights blinked on their slow cycle. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the blizzard was building again, the kind of heavy, windless snowfall that accumulates fast and erases edges, turning the world soft and white and indistinct. I walked to the dining room and began to clear the table. I worked methodically, the way I did everything. Plates stacked in order of size, glasses by the stem, carefully, set in rows by the sink, serving dishes soaked in hot water. I found the good dish soap under the cabinet and used it because I was using their kitchen and I wasn't going to skimp on their dishes. The water was cold when I first turned on the tap. I didn't adjust it. I washed each glass by hand. I was aware that there was a dishwasher, a commercial-grade Miele, because of course there was, but I found I didn't want to use it. There was something useful about the cold water and the repetitive motion. It gave my hands something to do while my mind worked. I had been planning this for a long time. Not this trip. Specifically, not the invoice, not the spa, not any of the specific cruelties of this particular Christmas. You can't plan for the exact shape that contempt takes, but I had been planning for what came after. My phone buzzed on the counter where I'd set it. One message. Nathan Cole, my executive assistant, calling from the Denver office at what was now nearly 10 o'clock at night. Nathan kept the same hours I did, which was one of the reasons I'd hired him. The message read, Phase 1 confirmed. Transfer complete. Vantage now holds 100% of Reed Hospitality Group debt, $4.2 million principal plus accrued interest. Bank notifications sent to borrower of record. Ready to proceed on your signal. I read it twice, set the phone down, picked up the next glass and kept washing. I want to explain something about Reed Hospitality Group, because it matters for what came next. My father, Ryan Reed, had built the company over 20 years. 3 boutique hotels in Colorado mountain towns, the kind of properties that catered to a particular kind of traveler. People who wanted luxury without the chain hotel sterility, who wanted the feeling of a place that had a history. He'd been good at it. Not brilliant, not revolutionary, but careful and consistent, and those qualities compound over time. He died 3 winters ago from a heart attack at 61 in his office in Denver on a Tuesday afternoon in February. His assistant found him. I was in Tokyo when I got the call. I had been in the middle of a due diligence meeting on a distressed manufacturing acquisition, and I excused myself to take the call in the hallway, and I stood in that hallway for a long time afterward, not crying exactly, just stopped. The way a clock stops when the battery dies. Still, in the same position, but no longer running. I flew home the next day, and over the following months, as I watched Logan Harlow take the reins of Reed Hospitality with the confidence of someone who had earned what he'd actually inherited, I began to pay attention to the numbers. The numbers were not good. I won't get into all of it here. The specifics will come later, in a room with better lighting and a conference table and people who will have no choice but to listen. But what I will say is this. I watched my father's company begin to decline under Logan's management in ways that had very specific signatures. Occupancy rates drifting downward, maintenance deferred in ways that looked like budget management, but were actually the early signs of neglect. And then, buried in the quarterly reports that Logan sent to my mother with cheerful cover letters about strategic adjustment periods, there were cash flows that didn't quite balance. Transfers to a consulting entity I couldn't find any record of. I had been watching for 18 months. 4 months ago, I made a decision. I instructed Nathan to begin acquiring Reed Hospitality's debt, quietly, through Vantage Capital Partners, through the kind of layered corporate structure that makes a transaction look like a dozen different things until you know exactly where to look. By the time I drove up to Aspen on December 24th, Vantage Capital Partners owned every dollar of debt that Reed Hospitality Group owed to First Mountain Bank, all $4.2 million of it. My family thought I was coming home for Christmas. I was. I was also coming to collect. I finished the dishes at 11:15. I wiped down the counters. I wrapped the leftover food and put it in the refrigerator. I found a broom in the utility closet and swept the kitchen floor because the chef had left a dusting of flour near the island and it bothered me. Then I made myself a cup of Earl Grey. I travel with my own tea bags, which Miley had once called deeply sad and which I considered practical. And I sat down at the kitchen island with my hands wrapped around the mug and let myself be still for a moment. Somewhere above me, the nanny and the 2-year-old were sleeping. Outside, the snow kept falling. I thought about my father, about the way he used to make tea in the morning. Not Earl Grey, he preferred a plain black breakfast blend, and stand at the kitchen window looking out at whatever was outside the window with the expression of a man conducting an inventory of what he had. Not what he wanted, what he had. He was good at that. I thought about what he'd said to me the last time I saw him. We'd had dinner in Denver, just the two of us, and afterward, walking to our cars in the parking garage, he'd stopped and looked at me for a long moment. He'd said, "I know you're doing something. I don't know what it is, but I know it's bigger than anything you've told us about." I hadn't confirmed it. I just looked at him in the fluorescent light of the parking garage and something had passed between us. An understanding that didn't need words, the kind that exists between people who think alike. He'd squeezed my arm once and walked to his car. 2 weeks later, he was gone. I finished my tea. I rinsed the mug, dried it, put it back in the cabinet. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Nathan. Find everything there is on an entity called Sapphire. Anything connected to Logan Harlow. I want it tonight. I went upstairs to the guest suite. The room at the far end of the hall, the smallest one, with the view of the utility road rather than the mountain. I set my phone on the nightstand. I lay down on top of the covers without undressing, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark, and I listened to the snow. I did not sleep. I was waiting. I heard him at 2 a.m, not loudly. Logan Harlow was not a loud man when he was afraid. Fear made him quieter, more controlled, the way a leak in a dam doesn't announce itself. It just finds the smallest available opening and moves through it with terrible precision. I had been lying on top of the covers in the guest suite, still dressed, still waiting, when I heard the footsteps on the hardwood of the hallway below. Careful footsteps. The footsteps of someone who did not want to wake the house. I got up and moved to the door without turning on any lights. The hallway outside my room was dark. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened. Below, at the far end of the ground floor corridor, a thin line of yellow light showed beneath the door of the small powder room, the one tucked behind the staircase, the one you'd choose if you wanted to make a phone call without being overheard. Far enough from the bedrooms, small enough that sound stayed inside it. He must have forgotten that sound travels differently in an empty house. I came down the stairs slowly, staying close to the wall where the treads didn't flex. I positioned myself in the hallway, back flat against the plaster, 6 feet from that line of yellow light, and I listened. "I understand what you're telling me." Logan's voice was low, controlled in the way that suggested enormous effort. The voice of a man performing composure for an audience of one. "But what I need you to understand is that this is a timing issue, not a solvency issue. Those are categorically different situations, and I need you to treat them accordingly." Pause. "Then push it. I'm asking you to push it." A breath. "If those operating accounts get frozen before Friday, we miss payroll across 3 properties. You know what happens when hospitality workers don't get paid? They walk, they talk, and I promise you, a union grievance is the last thing either of us wants attached to this." Another pause, longer. "I know what the number is." Something shifted in his voice, just slightly, the way a floorboard shifts under too much weight. 4.2 is manageable. I have assets I'm in the process of liquidating. I need 72 hours. That's all I'm asking for. I stayed very still. Do not send the default notice to the main office. This part came faster, with more urgency underneath it. Julia Reed is the registered agent. If she receives a formal default notification, there is no version of this where that ends well for anyone. Just hold it at your level. Give me until Monday. A pause. Then, quietly, "I appreciate that. I do." And then, so quietly, I almost missed it. And the Sapphire situation stays separate. That's not on the Reed hospitality books. It doesn't come up in any of this. We're clear on that? Silence. Good. The call ended. I heard him exhale, a long, slow breath like a man surfacing from underwater. I moved back to the staircase and climbed it without a sound, returning to the guest suite and closing the door softly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. 4.2 million. I had known the number. I had purchased that number 4 months ago, through 3 layers of corporate structure, from a bank that was quietly delighted to move the liability off its balance sheet. But knowing a number and hearing the man responsible for it begs someone to hide it from your mother. Those were different experiences entirely. What I hadn't known, until 30 seconds ago, was that he was still actively concealing the scale of it. That Julia and Miley were sleeping upstairs in this $12 million house, dreaming of Range Rovers and spa packages, with no idea that the company that funded all of it was 4 months from collapse. And Sapphire. He'd been careful about that, but not careful enough. I picked up my phone, opened the encrypted messaging app I used with Nathan. Whatever you found on Sapphire, I need it first thing tomorrow morning. All of it. I set the phone down. Outside, the snow fell in silence. I did not sleep. Nathan's report arrived at 6:47 a.m. I read it in bed with my back against the headboard and the room still gray with early morning light. It was 11 pages. By the time I reached the end, I had read the whole thing twice, and I understood with complete clarity the shape of what Logan Harlow had been doing for the past 16 months. I got up, showered, dressed, black jeans, a gray merino sweater, practical, anonymous. I went downstairs and made myself tea and sat at the kitchen island and waited. He came down at 8. He was wearing a cashmere robe, charcoal gray, and he was carrying 2 mugs, one for himself, one clearly intended for me. The oat milk latte, still steaming, that he set down in front of me without being asked. He remembered I didn't drink regular milk. He'd been paying attention to that kind of detail, which told me something about how long he'd been planning this conversation. "Good morning," he said, with the warmth of a man who has decided that warmth is strategically useful. "Good morning," I said. He settled onto the stool across from me, cradled his mug, and let a moment of comfortable silence pass, the kind of silence that's meant to signal ease, familiarity, the suggestion that what comes next is just 2 people talking. Then he reached under the counter and placed a folder on the island between us. Dark leather. The kind of folder that holds documents you want to look substantial. "Emma," he said, "I want to talk to you about your future." He was good at it. I'll give him that. He laid it out carefully. The trust fund my father had left me, $250,000 sitting in a low-yield savings account, losing ground to inflation every month. The opportunity he was offering, a high-performing equity vehicle, exclusive to accredited investors, projected annual returns of 18%. In 3 years, he said, you're looking at 400,000, maybe more. He let that number settle. And all I need from you is this. He slid the document across the island. A fountain pen followed it. I picked up the document and read it. It was a power of attorney, full, unrestricted transfer of asset control. Not an investment agreement, not a fund subscription form, a power of attorney, which meant that once I signed it, Logan Harlow could do anything he chose with the money my father had left me. Invest it, transfer it, spend it. He could use it to patch a $4.2 million hole while my mother slept upstairs. I set the document down. "I'm sorry," I said. "What's an equity vehicle exactly? Is it like a mutual fund? I've seen those advertised." Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of something he suppressed quickly. "It's considerably more sophisticated than a mutual fund. You don't need to understand the mechanics, you just need to know that it performs." "But what if the market drops? Do I lose everything? Or is it insured like a bank account?" He set his mug down with a small, precise click. "Emma." The warmth was thinning at the edges. Stop asking questions you don't have the background to evaluate the answers to. I'm offering you a significant financial opportunity. The appropriate response is gratitude. I tilted my head. I just want to make sure I understand what I'm signing. You're signing something that will double your money. That's what you're signing. The patience in his voice had compressed to something smaller and harder. Look, I'll be direct with you. The family is in a difficult period financially. We need liquidity. Your trust fund is sitting there doing nothing, and it could make a real difference right now. I am asking you as family to step up." I looked at him, I looked at the document, I looked at the pen. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I think I'd like to keep my money where it is. I like knowing exactly where it is." The mask came off in increments. First the warmth that evaporated cleanly, like morning condensation. Then the patience, which lasted another 30 seconds before his jaw set and his shoulders squared, and he became, very suddenly, the version of Logan Harlow that his opposing counsel saw. "Let me be very clear with you," he said. His voice had dropped an octave and lost all its social lubrication. "You don't actually have a choice here. You can sign this voluntarily, and we call it a mutual arrangement, or I file a petition for conservatorship with the probate court in Denver on Monday morning." I looked at him steadily. "I don't know what that means." "It means I go to a judge and I demonstrate that you are incapable of managing your own financial affairs." He leaned forward slightly. "Think about what your life looks like on paper, Emma. 34 years old, withdrew from her MBA program 4 years ago, no degree, no employment history for 6 years, no documented assets, no professional affiliations, living off a trust fund her father left her out of pity." He paused. "A good attorney, which I am, can construct a very compelling case from those facts, and I have relationships with judges in that system. I have colleagues who can provide the medical evaluations that would support that case." The kitchen was very quiet. "Once a conservatorship is established," he continued, "I become your legal guardian. I control your accounts, your financial decisions, your ability to travel or enter into contracts. And the first thing I do, in my capacity as your conservator, is liquidate that trust fund to address the company's immediate obligations." He sat back. "So you see, this isn't really a negotiation. I'm giving you the option to do this with some dignity. The alternative is considerably less dignified." He slid the document toward me again. "You have until dinner." I looked at the document for a long moment. I looked at the pen. Then I looked up at the corner of the kitchen, at the small device mounted above the cabinet disguised as a smoke detector that I had installed myself 2 days before this trip, during an afternoon visit to check on the property that none of them had known about. The red light was blinking slowly. It had been recording since 6 o'clock that morning. Everything Logan Harlow had just said, the conservatorship threat, the judicial relationships, the medical evaluations, the explicit plan to use fabricated legal proceedings to seize my inheritance, was documented, time-stamped, saved to a secure server in Denver. What he had just described was criminal extortion. It was also, depending on how a prosecutor chose to characterize it, conspiracy to commit fraud. I looked back at him. I let my shoulders drop slightly. I let my breath come a little unevenly. I looked at the document, and I looked at the pen, and I let my expression do what he was expecting it to do. "Okay," I said. My voice was quieter than it had been. "Okay, I'll sign." What happened next was not something I'd planned, but it was something I should have anticipated, because I knew my mother, and I knew that when Logan had what he wanted, he would go upstairs and tell her, and she would come down. She arrived 4 minutes after Logan left the kitchen with the folder tucked under his arm. She was already dressed. Julia Reed was always already dressed. It was one of her superpowers. And she had the bright, forward energy of someone who had received good news and was here to consolidate it. What she did not expect was to find me sitting calmly at the island with a fresh cup of tea. "I heard you're being reasonable," she said, which was her way of acknowledging what Logan had told her without acknowledging how he'd accomplished it. "I signed the document," I said. "Good." She nodded once, efficiently. "I'm glad you understand what the family needs right now." "Can I ask you something?" She had started to turn away. She stopped. "Dad's trust," I said. "He left it to me specifically, not to the family, to me. He wrote my name in the document. Do you know why he did that?" A small pause. "Your father was sentimental about you." "He was deliberate," I said. "He was one of the most deliberate people I've ever known. He didn't do things out of sentiment. He did them because he'd thought them through." Julia looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between impatience and something older than impatience. "The situation has changed since he died," she said. "He didn't account for what the company would need." "No," I agreed. "He didn't." She left. Miley arrived 10 minutes later, drawn by some family radar that activates when there's drama to witness, and she came in with her phone already in her hand and found the sketchbook I'd left visible on the counter. The worn leather journal that I carried everywhere, the one filled with handwritten notes and hand-drawn diagrams that she'd always dismissed as the idle doodling of someone with too much time. She picked it up without asking. She flipped through it. I watched her eyes move across pages dense with figures, arrows, organizational charts, acquisition timelines, debt conversion structures. "What is all this?" she said. "Notes," I said. She turned to a page near the middle. On it was a detailed diagram of a corporate structure: holding companies, subsidiary entities, capital flows, debt instruments. At the top of the page, in my handwriting, were the words Reed Hospitality Group, Debt Acquisition Pathway. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she snapped the sketchbook shut and dropped it on the counter. "You were always so weird," she said, and she left. I waited until I heard her footsteps on the stairs. Then I picked up my phone and typed to Nathan. Phase 2. The fish took the bait. Move now. The email arrived at 9:52 a.m. I know the exact time because I was sitting in the corner chair of the great room, reading, when I heard Logan's phone alarm. Not a ringtone, but the distinctive double chime he'd apparently set for high-priority emails. I heard it from across the room. I kept my eyes on my book. I heard him pick up the phone. I heard the silence that followed, which was the loudest thing in the room. "Julia," he said. Something in his voice made my mother look up from the newspaper she was reading at the dining table. Something in his voice made Miley stop scrolling. "The bank sold our debt," he said. The next 4 minutes were something I have replayed many times since, the way you replay a piece of music that hits something precisely. Logan's voice, explaining it. First Mountain Bank has transferred the Reed Hospitality loan portfolio, all of it, to a private investment firm, a company called Vantage Capital Partners. Julia's voice, not yet alarmed. "What does that mean? Transferred?" Logan's voice, changing. "It means they sold it. The debt. Vantage owns it now." Miley, "Who's Vantage?" Logan's fingers on his phone, typing. The pause while the search returned results, and then the particular quality of silence that falls when you search for a company and find almost nothing. No website, no press releases, no LinkedIn profiles, no news coverage, just a Delaware registration number and a Denver mailing address. "They're a ghost firm," Logan said quietly. "No public presence, no named leadership." Another email arrived. I heard his phone chime again. "They want full repayment," he said. $4.2 million within 24 hours. Miley, 24 hours. Julia, very still. "That's not possible." Logan, "I know." The room shifted. I turned a page of my book. Julia's pivot to blame was, professionally speaking, impressive in its speed. She turned to where I was sitting within approximately 90 seconds of processing the information, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who has identified a cause. "You," she said. I looked up from my book. "Me?" "Every time something goes wrong in this family, you are somewhere nearby." She was standing now, moving toward me with the restless energy of someone who needs to put their distress somewhere. "I don't know what you've done or how, but I know that you walked into this house, and since then, everything has—" "Julia." Logan said her name sharply. He needed her focused, not spiraling. "That's not helpful." She stopped, looked at him, then at me, then back at him. "Fix this," she said, and went to stand at the window. I turned another page. "I read something about Vantage Capital," I said after a moment. Logan looked at me with the expression of a man who has run out of patience for everyone in the room and is now managing it as a collective entity. "You don't need to contribute to this conversation, Emma. I'm just mentioning, I read that firms like this don't usually foreclose immediately. The operational costs of taking over a hospitality business are significant. They usually prefer to negotiate some kind of ongoing management arrangement, at least in the short term. I know how distressed asset firms operate. Of course." I went back to my book. "I just thought it was worth mentioning." He turned away. He made 12 phone calls over the next 2 hours. I know it was 12 because I counted the number of times I heard him say Vantage Capital Partners in the clipped, controlled tone of a man describing something that is threatening him. By the 12th call, the control was showing its seams. The last call I heard clearly. James Whitfield, a senior partner at Logan's own firm, whose voice carried through the library door. Logan, I'm going to say this once. Vantage Capital is not a firm you approach. Nobody knows who runs it. They operate through shell companies, they have unlimited capital, and they do not negotiate. If they bought your debt, they already own you. My advice is to get your personal assets in order and prepare for the likelihood that the company is gone. Logan didn't respond to that. I heard him end the call. Then I heard the particular, specific sound of a fist hitting a wooden surface. I turned a page. At 2 o'clock, the landline rang. The landline, an actual telephone mounted on the wall of the kitchen, a courtesy feature of the property rental that none of us had touched since arrival. It rang with the startling, old-fashioned insistence of a rotary bell, and every person in the house stopped what they were doing. Logan crossed to it in 4 long strides. "This is Logan Harlow." His professional voice, back snapped into place like a mask grabbed on the way out the door. I watched from the hallway. I watched his posture change, watched the tension leave his shoulders in a way that looked like relief, which told me exactly what the voice on the other end was offering. "Yes," he said. "Of course. 4 o'clock works perfectly. We'll be there." A pause. "Thank you. We're looking forward to it." He hung up. He turned to the room. "That was Vantage Capital," he said, "their executive assistant. The chairman wants to meet with us in person. Today, 4 o'clock, at the Ritz-Carlton." He straightened his cuffs. Something had reignited behind his eyes. The particular flame of a man who believes he has just been given one more chance. "They want to talk." My mother closed her eyes briefly, the way people do when they receive news they've been praying for. "Of course they do," she said. "They know who we are." Logan prepared for the meeting the way generals prepare for battles they expect to win. He turned the library into a command center, the printer running, documents organized into leather-bound binders, talking points drafted and rehearsed. I caught a glimpse of the financial projections he was preparing to present. Occupancy rates adjusted to reflect numbers the hotels hadn't seen in 3 years. Revenue forecasts built on assumptions that required a market that didn't currently exist. They were not projections. They were a fiction. A well-constructed, professionally formatted fiction that Logan intended to present to a room of sophisticated investors as evidence that Reed Hospitality was a company worth saving. This was, technically, securities fraud. I noted it for the file. He came to find me at 3 o'clock while I was in the guest suite changing into fresh clothes. He had a garment bag over his arm, which he held out to me. "Wear this," he said. Inside, a simple black dress, knee-length, unadorned, the kind of thing a professional woman might wear to work at a company where professional women were expected to be seen and not particularly noticed. "Why am I coming?" I asked. "Because you're a Reed. Family businesses appeal to private equity. It signals stability and legacy. I want them to see the family united." He held the bag out further. "But your role is specific. You sit in the corner. You pour water if the pitchers run low. You do not speak unless I indicate that you should. Is that clear?" I took the garment bag. "And Emma." He waited until I met his eyes. "I know you think you have opinions about how this should go. Keep them to yourself. If you say something that derails this meeting, I will make sure the consequences for you are significant. Do you understand me?" "Yes," I said. "I understand." I understood completely. The drive to the Ritz-Carlton took 15 minutes through streets that the plows had half cleared, the Cadillac Escalade Logan had rented moving carefully through the accumulated snow. He sat in the back between Julia and Miley. I sat in the front passenger seat. He had handed me his briefcase at the door of the chalet. Heavy, expensive leather, loaded with the fraudulent binders. And asked me to carry it. I held it on my lap for the full 15-minute drive. Inside that briefcase were documents that, if presented to a sophisticated institutional investor as accurate representations of Reed Hospitality's financial position, would constitute fraud. I had spent the drive mentally cataloging which specific representations were false and how far each one deviated from the actual figures, which I happened to have memorized. At some point during the drive, while Logan was rehearsing talking points under his breath in the back seat, Miley leaned forward and said to me quietly, "If they want collateral, Logan mentioned Dad's cabin, the one he left you." I didn't respond. "I know it's yours technically," she said, "but it's just sitting there. You don't even use it. I looked out the window at the snow-covered pines. I use it, I said. She sat back. I opened the encrypted app on my phone, keeping it below the dashboard, and typed to Nathan. Fraudulent financial projections confirmed. Binders prepared for presentation, adding to the file. His response came in under a minute. D.A. contact confirmed, standing by. The sports bar in the Ritz-Carlton lobby was doing a slow winter business. A handful of après-ski guests settled into low chairs with cocktails the color of autumn leaves. The lobby itself was the particular brand of luxury that announces itself quietly. Heavy stone floors, towering arrangements of white flowers, staff who moved as though they'd practiced it. We had just cleared the revolving door when Logan stopped. He'd seen someone. Across the lobby, near the concierge desk, a tall man in a good suit was finishing a conversation with the concierge and turning in our direction. "James," Logan said under his breath, and then, loudly, with the social warmth that he could switch on like a light, "James, what are you doing in Aspen?" James Whitfield, I recognized him from photographs Logan had at the house, was about Logan's age, silver at the temples, the particular bearing of a man who had been at his firm long enough to stop trying to prove anything. He crossed the lobby with an outstretched hand. "Logan, I could ask you the same thing. I thought you were in Telluride this week." Change of plans. Logan shook his hand warmly, a performance of ease. "You know Julia and Miley." He gestured. Then his hand moved in my direction and something shifted in his face. A microsecond of calculation that I watched happen and he didn't know I was watching. "And this is Emma," he said. "She's with us for the trip, helps with luggage and errands." A small, self-deprecating laugh. "You know how it is. Good help is hard to find." James Whitfield looked at me briefly, nodded, and returned his attention to Logan. I stood very still. I held the briefcase. I looked at the back of Logan Harlow's head and I thought, I will remember this moment when the time comes, and the time is less than 2 hours away. The presidential suite occupied most of the top floor of the Ritz-Carlton, and the conference room attached to it was the kind of space designed to communicate a very specific message. Whoever sits on this side of the table has already won. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out at the mountain, which the storm had partially revealed. The peaks showing through in glimpses between clouds, enormous and indifferent. The table was glass and chrome, the chairs leather, the lighting recessed and flattering in the way that expensive lighting is always flattering. Victor Sterling and his associate were seated on one side of the table. They did not stand when we entered. They did not smile. They looked like men who had conducted many meetings of this kind and found them neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply part of a process that would conclude in a predetermined direction. At the head of the table, there was a single high-backed leather chair. It was turned away from the room, facing the window, so that whoever occupied it was visible only as a suggestion. The top of a head, a hand resting on the armrest, the faint curl of steam rising from a teacup on the side table. Logan cleared his throat. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." His courtroom voice, present, assured, slightly louder than the room required. "I'm Logan Harlow. This is Julia Reed, Miley Reed Harlow, and our half-beat. Our assistant, Emma. We're the leadership team of Reed Hospitality Group, and we're grateful for the opportunity to discuss." Sterling raised one hand, a small gesture, an absolutely final one. Logan stopped mid-sentence. "Mr. Harlow," Sterling said, "we're not here to listen to a presentation. We've completed our due diligence." He slid a folder across the table. It stopped in front of Logan. Reed Hospitality Group is operating at a 38% deficit relative to break-even. Your actual portfolio-wide occupancy rate is 41%. The revenue projections in the binders you've just distributed are materially false. We have the source documents. He paused. "We could file a fraud complaint based solely on what you've handed us in this room. I want you to understand that before we continue." Logan's face had gone the color of old paper. "Those are forward-looking. They are not." Sterling's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "They are backward-looking numbers that have been adjusted to appear forward-looking. We know the difference, Mr. Harlow." Julia leaned forward. "The Reed name carries 40 years of reputation in this market. That equity, brand equity, does not service debt, Mrs. Reed." Sterling's associate spoke for the first time. "The outstanding principal is $4.2 million. You have neither the liquid assets nor the demonstrated income to service that obligation. Vantage Capital Partners is therefore proceeding with asset recovery under the terms of the original loan agreement." He opened his own folder. The 3 hotel properties and the private residence used as collateral will be transferred to Vantage Capital Holdings by close of business Friday. We'll need you to vacate the Aspen property by 5 o'clock today. Miley made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Logan stood up. His chair scraped the floor. You cannot do this, he said. We have rights, we have standing. I will have an injunction filed by morning. You're welcome to try, Sterling said. He didn't look up from his folder. I want to speak to the chairman. Logan pointed toward the high-backed chair at the head of the table, still turned toward the window, still and patient. Right now, directly. Whatever this process is, I want to talk to the person who made the decision to buy this debt, and I want to explain to them the value of what they're acquiring. You said face-to-face. The chairman is present, Sterling said, and the chairman's decision is final. Then let me... You've presented your case, Mr. Harlow. The response is no. Logan looked at the chair. He looked at Sterling. He looked at his wife, his mother-in-law, the stack of fraudulent binders in front of him. Then, with the desperation of a man who has run out of legitimate options and is now reaching for whatever remains, he turned toward me. I was standing in the corner of the room where I'd been standing since we entered, holding a crystal pitcher of water that no one had asked me to fill, wearing the black dress, my hair pulled back, my expression carefully arranged to suggest nothing. Wait, Logan said. His voice had changed. The authority had drained out of it, leaving something rawer underneath. We have additional collateral, assets not listed in the initial disclosure. He pointed at me. Her, my sister-in-law, Emma Reed. She has a trust fund, $250,000 liquid, and a lakefront property, unencumbered, fully paid. I have a signed power of attorney giving me full control over both assets. He opened his briefcase with shaking hands. He found the document, the one I'd signed with a pen that made an illegible mark that bore no resemblance to my legal signature, which he had been too desperate and too arrogant to verify. He dropped it on the table. I can liquidate both today, immediately, as a good faith payment while we develop a restructuring plan. Take it. Take all of it. Sterling picked up the document. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at me. Ms. Reed, he said, you are present in this room. Are you confirming voluntary consent to this arrangement? Logan spun to face me. His eyes were doing something I hadn't seen them do before, something unguarded, where the calculation lived just underneath a very thin surface of pleading. Emma, he said, tell them you agree. I set the crystal pitcher down on the side table. I heard it clink against the wood. I straightened my shoulders. I smoothed the front of the black dress, the dress he had chosen to make me look like furniture, like backdrop, like the hired help. I walked out of the corner. I walked past Sterling and his associate, who moved almost imperceptibly to create space for me. I walked past Julia, whose hand had risen to her mouth, past Miley, who had gone very still in a way I'd never seen her be still before. I walked to the head of the table. I put my hand on the back of the high leather chair. Emma. Logan's voice cracked slightly. What are you doing? Sit down. You're embarrassing. I pulled the chair out. I sat down. The leather settled quietly around me. Sterling and his associate rose to their feet simultaneously. Madam Chairman, Sterling said. The room went absolutely silent. Logan Harlow took one step backward, then another. His hand found the edge of the table and gripped it. You, he said. It came out barely above a whisper. Your Vantage Capital. I reached into the leather folder on the table in front of me and removed the silver remote. One press of a button, and the motorized blinds descended across the panoramic windows, dimming the room. A second press, and the screen behind me illuminated. The Vantage Capital Partners logo. Clean, minimal, authoritative. And below it, in clear sans serif type, Emma Reed, founder and CEO. I watched my family read it. I watched the information move through them the way a current moves through water. You can't see it directly, but you can see everything it touches change. I didn't leave my MBA program because I failed, I said. My voice was even. I had been rehearsing this in various forms for a long time, not for drama, but because clarity matters, and I wanted to be clear. I left because I was running an investment fund from my apartment, and I had to choose between the degree and the work. I chose the work. I clicked the remote again. A timeline appeared on the screen. a series of acquisitions spanning 6 years, each one annotated with entry price, restructuring approach, and outcome. Over the last 6 years, I've acquired 7 distressed companies. I've restructured 4 of them into profitable operations and exited 3 at an average return of 340%. Vantage Capital Partners manages a portfolio currently valued at just over $200 million. Logan was shaking his head, small, involuntary movements like someone who keeps hearing a sound they can't locate. "You drive a Honda," he said. "I do. You shop at—" "I know where I shop, Logan." I set the remote down. "I also know what you've been spending, which brings us to the reason we're all here." I pressed the remote one more time. The timeline disappeared. In its place, a spreadsheet. Columns of dates and figures rendered in the clean red and white of a financial audit. 16 months of transaction records, each row a transfer from the Reed Hospitality Group operating account to a receiving entity. The entity's name appeared at the top of every row, Sapphire Advisory, LLC. I heard Miley inhale. Sapphire Advisory, LLC, I said, has no website. It has no employees on record. It provides no documented services to Reed Hospitality Group. It has a registered business address in Denver, a residential address specifically belonging to a penthouse apartment currently leased to a woman named Catherine Morse. The room was perfectly still. I clicked to the next slide. The lease agreement appeared. 2 signatures at the bottom, tenant and guarantor. The guarantor's name was Logan Harlow. Over 16 months, I said, approximately $412,000 was transferred from Reed Hospitality Group's operating account to Sapphire Advisory, LLC, and from there to Catherine Morse's personal accounts. The supporting documentation includes a credit card statement linked to Sapphire Advisory. I clicked again. Showing a Tiffany purchase of $8,400, a lease on a Porsche 911 valued at $76,000, and monthly spa services totaling approximately $2,200 per month. I looked at Miley. She was looking at the screen. Her face had done something I'd never seen it do. It had gone completely, fundamentally blank. Not the blankness of someone who isn't processing, but the blankness of someone who is processing too much too fast, and the system has briefly suspended all output while it catches up. "Logan told me," she said slowly, "that we couldn't afford to go to Hawaii this summer." Her voice was very careful, like someone walking on ice and testing every step. "He said the company needed us to be conservative. He said we shouldn't do the kitchen renovation. He said—" She stopped. She looked at her husband. Logan was not looking at his wife. He was looking at the screen, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has watched an exit close and is now calculating how quickly the room is running out of air. "Miley," he started. She picked up the glass of water in front of her and threw it in his face. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a precise one. The glass lifted, the water released, the glass set back down on the table. It landed on him completely, soaking his collar and tie and running down his jaw. He stood there, dripping. "I've sent this documentation to the Denver District Attorney's Office," I said into the silence. "Wire fraud, misappropriation of corporate funds. The DA received the file this morning at 7:45. I looked at Logan. "You're not being fired today, Logan. You've been fired since this morning. What happens today is that you leave." He turned to face me. The water was still dripping from his jaw, and something in him, the last structure holding the performance upright, gave way. He moved fast, faster than I expected, pushing up from the table and lunging across it toward me, his hands reaching 2 figures separated from the walls on either side of the room. The security team I had positioned before the meeting, dressed in hotel staff clothing, stationary as furniture until this moment. They caught Logan before his hands reached anything. He went to the floor. He was still shouting when they brought him to his feet. My name, accusations, threats. But the sound had changed. It wasn't the voice of a man with power anymore. It was just noise. "The police are in the lobby," I said. "Please take him down." The doors opened. Logan Harlow was escorted through them. The doors closed. The room was quiet again. I sat at the head of the table and looked at my mother and my sister. Julia's hand was pressed flat against her sternum as though she was checking that something was still beating. Miley was looking at the door through which her husband had just been removed, her expression caught somewhere between grief and a terrible, clarifying relief. Outside, through the gap in the blinds, the storm was passing. I could see the first edge of pale sky at the margin of the clouds. I reached for my tea. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The ride back to the chalet took 11 minutes. Nobody spoke. Logan's absence filled the car the way absences sometimes do, not with emptiness, but with a specific shape pressure, the outline of a person who had occupied a great deal of space and was now simply gone. Miley sat with Jack on her lap. The nanny had brought him down to the lobby while we were upstairs, and he had reached for his mother with the uncomplicated confidence of a 2-year-old who has no reason to believe the world is anything other than safe. And she held him with both arms and looked out the window and said nothing. Julia sat very straight, the way she always sat, but something in the straightness was different now. It wasn't the posture of a woman maintaining authority. It was the posture of a woman holding herself together by force of habit, because habit was what remained when everything else had been removed. I sat in the front passenger seat and watched the snow-covered road and thought about nothing in particular, which was not something I did often and which I recognized as the particular mental state that follows the completion of something long and consuming. Not peace exactly, but the absence of the forward pressure that had been running constantly for months. The chalet came into view through the pines. Cole pulled into the driveway and stopped the car. No one moved for a moment. Then Miley opened her door, stepped out into the cold with Jack on her hip, and walked to the front door without looking back. Julia followed, her heels precise on the frozen gravel, her coat pulled close. I sat in the car for another minute. I looked at the house, the amber light in the windows, the Christmas tree visible through the glass, the black box sitting somewhere in the back of all of it, behind the Hermes boxes, patient as it had been since I placed it there on Christmas Eve. It was time. Inside, the chalet felt different. I don't know how to explain this exactly, except to say that a house absorbs the energy of the people who occupy it, and Logan Harlow had occupied this particular house with a great deal of energy. The energy of performance, of management, of the constant low-level effort of maintaining a version of reality that required maintenance. With that energy gone, the room seemed to breathe differently, quieter, larger somehow, and also more honest. Miley had taken Jack upstairs. I could hear her moving around in the room above. The soft thud of small shoes being removed, the particular cadence of a mother settling a toddler who needed to sleep. Julia stood in the center of the great room, still in her coat, looking at nothing. I went to the Christmas tree. I found the black box where Julia had placed it 4 days ago, tucked at the very back, behind a large gift basket of imported cheese and a stack of Hermes boxes. I reached through the branches and retrieved it. A pine needle caught on my sleeve. I carried the box to the coffee table and set it down. "Sit down, please," I said. Julia looked at me. Something in my tone, not a request, but not a command either, something quieter than both, made her move to the sofa. She sat. I sat across from her in the armchair my father had always favored when we stayed here, the wingback near the fire, angled toward the room. He used to sit there with his coffee in the morning and read the paper, and I had a sudden, clear memory of him doing exactly that. The crease of the newspaper, the particular way he held his mug, the fact that he always folded the paper back to the business section first and worked his way forward. I set the box on the table between us. "I want to tell you what this is," I said, "before you open it." Julia looked at the box. "What is it?" "Bo duanacha toy banam truk," I said, then caught myself. Shifted back to English, the language of this room, this family, this moment. "Dad gave it to me 3 years ago, 2 weeks before he died." Miley came downstairs while I was still talking. She appeared at the foot of the stairs in a sweater and socks, Jack apparently settled, and she stood in the doorway to the great room reading the atmosphere of it. The fire, the box on the table, her mother on the sofa, me in the wingback. And she came in quietly and sat on the other end of the sofa from Julia. She didn't ask what was happening, she just sat. I continued. "He called me in October of that year," I said. 3 years ago, October. He asked if I could come to Denver for dinner, just the 2 of us. He didn't say why. I remembered that evening precisely. The restaurant he'd chosen, a quiet Italian place in Cherry Creek that he'd been going to for 20 years, where the owner knew his name and brought him a particular Barolo without being asked. We talked for 3 hours. He'd asked me about my work, careful, specific questions that told me he'd been thinking about them in advance. He'd listened in a way that most people don't, with his full attention, without formulating his response while I was still speaking. And at the end of the evening, over the last of the wine, he'd put a sealed envelope on the table between us. Not the box, not yet, just the envelope and a conversation. "I've been watching things," he'd said. "The company, Logan, the way the numbers have been moving." He'd turned his wine glass slowly on the tablecloth. "I'm not an alarmist, Emma. You know that. I don't say things I'm not sure about, but I'm sure about this. What I've built is not going in the direction I built it for." I'd asked him what he wanted me to do. He'd looked at me across the table and he'd smiled, the particular smile I associated with him most, a little wry, a little sad, deeply steady. "I want you to do what you already know how to do," he'd said. "I just need you to know that I know you can." 2 weeks later, his assistant had found him at his desk. I had been in Tokyo. I had stood in a hallway. I had not cried until I was on the plane, and then I had cried for 4 hours while the Pacific moved beneath me in the dark. The envelope he'd given me that night in Denver had contained 2 things: a handwritten note that said, "Trust your instincts. I always have," and the deed to the cabin, signed over to me, separate from the rest of the estate in a transfer he'd completed before the dinner. Before, I understood later, he'd told anyone he was sick. 3 months after the funeral, a box had been delivered to my apartment in Denver, delivered by hand by a lawyer I didn't recognize, with a note that said only, "He asked me to get this to you when the time was right. He said you'd know when to open it. I had kept it for 3 years. I had carried it to Aspen in my car, next to my practical waterproof boots and my $38 sweater, and I had placed it under a Christmas tree full of things that cost more than some people's monthly rent. And now it was time." "I've never opened it," I said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever is inside, I'm reading it for the first time with you." Julia was looking at the box with an expression I didn't have a name for. She had been wearing a version of her public face for so long, composed, directed, certain, that watching it come apart, even slowly, was like watching a tide go out. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in degrees, each one revealing something underneath that had been covered for years. "He gave this to you," she said. "Not an accusation, just the fact of it." "Yes." "Not to me." "No." A long pause. "Why?" I thought about this carefully before I answered, because the answer mattered and I wanted to give it accurately. "I think," I said, "because he knew I'd wait until the right time, and he knew what the right time looked like, even if he couldn't predict exactly when it would come." Julia was quiet for a moment. "He always trusted you differently than he trusted me," she said. It came out without the edge I would have expected. It came out like something she had been holding and had simply, finally put down. "I used to think it was favoritism. I told myself it was because you were the oldest, but," she stopped, "he trusted you because you were like him. You think the way he thought." I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to add to it. I picked up the box and placed it in front of her. "It should go to you," I said. Julia's hands on the box were not her usual hands. Her usual hands were instruments. Efficient, purposeful, always doing something with intention. These hands were uncertain. They moved to the lid of the box and rested there for a moment, and I saw her take a breath the way people breathe when they're preparing themselves for something they can't prepare for. She lifted the lid. Inside, the box was lined with dark blue velvet, and resting in the center of it was an envelope, cream-colored, thick, sealed with red wax. The wax had been pressed with a signet ring I recognized, the simple R that my father had worn on his right hand since before I was born. Julia's breath caught. She reached into the box and lifted the envelope with both hands. She turned it over. On the front, in Ryan Reed's handwriting, the precise, slightly forward-leaning script he'd used for everything he considered important, were 3 words: "For my family." Miley had moved closer on the sofa without seeming to realize she'd done it. She was close enough now that her shoulder was almost touching her mother's. Julia slid her finger under the wax seal. It broke cleanly. She unfolded the letter. Several pages I could see, close written in that same careful hand. And she began to read. "I am not going to tell you everything that was in my father's letter, because some of it belongs only to the people it was written for, and because some things lose something essential in the retelling. But I will tell you what I heard sitting across the fire from my mother and my sister watching them read. I will tell you that at some point in the first page, Julia's spine, which had been absolutely straight since we sat down, Released. Not collapsed. Released. The way a fist releases when it finally opens. I will tell you that Miley, who had been sitting with her arms wrapped around herself in a posture of pure self-protection, gradually let her arms drop to her lap. I will tell you that Julia turned to the second page and made a sound, not a word, just a sound low in her throat, and pressed her free hand to her mouth. And I will tell you what my father wrote, as best as I understood it from what came after. He wrote about the company, about what he'd built it for, which was not wealth. Wealth was a consequence, not a goal, but rather the particular satisfaction of making something that worked, something that served people well and lasted. He wrote about his concern for where it was going and his belief that it would find its way back if the right people were paying attention. He wrote about Julia. He wrote that he had loved her for 40 years with the specific, complicated love that comes from knowing someone in all their dimensions, their strengths and their fears, their generosity and their rigidity, and choosing them anyway, every day, even on the days when choosing was hard. He wrote that her greatest strength was also her greatest wound, the need to control outcomes, to manage appearances, to protect the family by keeping everything in order. He understood where it came from. He had watched it cost her things she didn't know she was paying. He wrote, "You tried to protect us by holding everything tightly, but some things can only be held loosely, Julia. Emma is one of them. She needed room to grow in her own direction, not the direction you could see from where you were standing. I should have said this to you while I was alive. That's my failure, not yours. But I'm saying it now." He wrote about Miley. He wrote that she had always been the one who felt everything most immediately, most visibly, the one whose happiness and unhappiness were legible to everyone in the room, because she had never learned, had never needed to learn, perhaps, to obscure them. He wrote that this was not a weakness, though it had been treated as one. He wrote that the ability to feel things fully and show it was something the world was actually hungry for, if it could be directed towards something true. He wrote, "You have more substance than you've been allowed to use, sweetheart. I hope you find a life that asks more of you. I think you'll surprise yourself." He wrote about me. I know this because when Julia reached that page, she looked up from the letter and looked at me across the fire, and her face did something I had not seen it do in so many years that I had almost stopped believing it was possible. She looked at me like she was seeing me, not the version of me she'd constructed, the disappointing one, the difficult one, the one who didn't fit, but the actual person sitting across from her in the firelight. She held my gaze for a long moment, then she looked back at the letter and kept reading. He wrote about the cabin. He wrote that he had signed it over to me specifically, not out of favoritism, but because he knew what it meant to me and he knew no one else would protect it the way I would. He wrote that it was the place where he had felt most himself. Not Ryan Reed the businessman, not Ryan Reed the husband or the father, but just Ryan, the man who had grown up without much and had learned early that the things worth keeping were usually small and quiet. He wrote, "I want you to keep it, Emma. Fish in it. Sit on the porch in the mornings. Take people there who will understand why it matters. It's yours. It was always yours." And then, at the end, on the last page, in writing that was slightly less steady than the rest, as though he'd been tired when he reached it, or moved, or both, he wrote something that I didn't know about until Julia read it aloud. She didn't announce that she was going to read it aloud. She simply reached the last page, and when she got to the final paragraph, her voice came, low and unsteady, and she read it into the room. "I know this family will go through things I can't see from here. I know there will be hardship, and I know there will be moments when you can't find your way to each other. If you're reading this, it means the moment has come, and Emma has decided it's time. That means the worst of it is probably already over. It also means she held on to this for as long as it needed to be held, which is exactly what I knew she would do. She has always known how to wait for the right time. I am so proud of all three of you, not for what you've accomplished, though I am proud of that too, but for what you are underneath the accomplishments. For the people you are when no one is watching, or when everyone is watching and it would be easier to be something else. Take care of each other, not the way you have been, not by managing each other, or protecting each other from the truth, or deciding for each other what is bearable. Take care of each other the way people do when they've run out of pretense and they're just left with love. That's all I wanted. That's what I was always trying to build. Dad." Julia lowered the letter. She set it on her lap. She looked at the fire, and then she did something I had not seen her do. Not at the funeral, not in the months after, not once in the 3 years since my father died. She put her face in her hands and she cried. Not the performed grief of someone who knows they're being watched and wants to be seen grieving correctly. The other kind. The kind that has been waiting in a locked room for 3 years and has finally, when the door opens, simply walked out. Miley put her arm around her mother. She didn't say anything. She just put her arm around Julia and held on, and after a moment, Julia leaned into her, and the two of them sat like that in the firelight while the storm outside finished spending itself against the mountains. I sat in my father's chair. I looked at the fire. I did not cry. Not yet. That would come later, in the car or on the plane or in the cabin in the spring, sitting on the porch in the early morning with a cup of tea and no one else around. It would come when it came. My father had understood that about me too. For now, I just sat, and for the first time in a very long time, the room felt like something I was part of, rather than something I was observing from the outside. I woke at 5:30 the next morning to silence. Not the silence of the storm, which had been its own kind of noise, the pressing, constant sound of wind and accumulation, but true silence. The silence of a world that has finished something and is waiting to begin the next thing. I got up and went to the window. The snow had stopped. The sky above the mountains was the particular blue-black of very early morning, not quite dark and not yet light, the first suggestion of dawn visible at the eastern edge of the peaks. The driveway was buried. The pine trees wore their snow with the patient dignity of things that have been through this many times before. I went downstairs and made tea. I sat at the kitchen island with my hands around the mug and my phone face down beside me, and I let the morning be what it was. Quiet, cold, the fire not yet lit, the house sleeping around me. Nathan had sent 3 messages overnight. I read them in order. The first, Logan Harlow processed and booked. Bond hearing scheduled for January 3rd. DA confirmed receipt of all documentation. Fraud file and extortion recording both admitted as preliminary evidence. His attorney is already requesting a plea negotiation. The second, asset transfer paperwork filed with Colorado Secretary of State at 11:47 p.m. Reed Hospitality Group now formally under Vantage Capital Management. Hotel GMs notified. Operations continuing normally. Staff unaffected. The third, sent at 2:14 a.m. Also, thought you should know. Catherine Morse's attorney contacted the DA's office voluntarily tonight. She's cooperating fully. Says she didn't know where the money was coming from. I set the phone down. I looked out the window at the snow. I thought about Logan Harlow in a Denver holding facility, and I felt nothing in particular about it. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just the recognition of a consequence arriving at the place a consequence arrives. I had not set out to destroy him. I had set out to protect what my father built, and Logan had placed himself in the path of that protection. The outcome was his, not mine. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Julia came into the kitchen at 6:15. She was wearing a wool robe, her hair not yet done, her face bare of the makeup she applied every morning as the first act of becoming Julia Reed. Without it, she looked closer to her age, which is not an insult. She looked simply like a woman of 62 who had lived 62 years and was not currently hiding any of them. She went to the coffee maker without speaking, poured a cup, added nothing to it. She came to the island and sat down across from me. We were quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology, she said. I looked at her. More than one, she continued. Her voice was even, but it was the evenness of something deliberate, not something easy. I've been composing it in my head since about 3 this morning, and I think the honest version is simply, I was wrong about you, for a long time. I told myself a story about who you were and what you were capable of, and I held on to that story well past the point where the evidence contradicted it, because letting go of it would have required me to admit that I'd caused harm. To you. Harm that I caused. She paused. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm genuinely sorry. I looked at my tea. There are moments when the thing you've been waiting to hear arrives, and instead of feeling the way you imagined it would feel, it just feels like landing. Like something that has been airborne for a very long time finally touching down. I know, I said. Thank you. She nodded once. We drank our coffee and tea in silence, and it was a different kind of silence than any we'd shared in years. Not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of 2 people who have said the most important thing and are resting in the space it opened. What happens to the company now? Julia asked after a while. I retain controlling interest through Vantage, I said. I'm bringing in a new management team, people who know hospitality and know these properties. The hotels stay open, the staff keeps their jobs. That was always the priority. And the chalet? It's a company asset. It'll be sold. I looked at her. The proceeds will be structured to provide you with income, not a windfall, but a stable, monthly income for as long as you need it. It was in the plan I had Victor Sterling prepare. She absorbed this. Your father would have done it exactly this way, she said, quietly, completely, without making it about himself. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He was better at this than I was, she said, at the generous version of things. You have time to learn, I said. She looked at me with something that was almost, after everything, the beginning of a smile. That's either very kind or very pointed. Both, I said. Probably. Miley came down at 8, Jack awake and already insistent on a specific cup that turned out to be in the dishwasher. She navigated this small crisis with the distracted efficiency of a mother on autopilot, and when Jack was settled with his cup and a piece of toast, she poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at me. I owe you an apology too, she said. Miley, no, let me. She wrapped both hands around her mug, the live stream, the invoice, on camera, the sketchbook. She paused. I knew it was cruel. I told myself it was funny, or that you didn't care, or that... I don't know. I was performing for people who weren't even in the room. She shook her head. That's not an excuse. I'm just telling you how I got there. I looked at her. Miley had always been the one who felt things loudly, visibly. My father's letter had been right about that. What she hadn't had for most of her adult life was a reason to feel things that were bigger than comfort and convenience. Now she had one. I didn't know yet what she would do with it, but I thought the capacity was there. I know, I said. I also know Logan shaped a lot of what you believed about money, about status, about what mattered. That's not an excuse either, but it's context. She nodded. She looked at Jack, who was systematically dismantling his toast into a collection of increasingly small pieces. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic in her head, tallying what she had, what she'd lost, what remained. What do I do now? She asked. It was not a rhetorical question. What do you want to do? She thought about this seriously. I've been talking to people online for 3 years, 80,000 of them, and 90% of what I've told them has been about things that didn't matter. She looked up. I think I want to talk about things that do. I don't know what that looks like yet. That's a reasonable place to start, I said, not knowing what it looks like yet. She almost smiled. You sound like Dad. I'll take that, I said. Jack reached across the table and patted my hand twice with a piece of toast. Miley made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. I looked down at the small, serious face of my nephew. He looked back at me with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who has decided I'm acceptable company. Toast? He offered. Thank you, I said. I'm okay. He ate it himself. Reasonable. I packed my bag at 9 o'clock. The same small rolling suitcase I'd arrived with. The same practical coat, the same waterproof boots. I folded the black dress, Logan's black dress, the one meant to make me look like Staff, and left it on the bed. I didn't need it anymore. It had served its purpose. I carried my bag downstairs. Julia and Miley were in the great room. Miley was on the floor with Jack, building something out of the cardboard boxes from the gift wrapping. Julia was sitting in the armchair, my father's chair, with the letter in her lap, not reading it, just holding it. I set my bag by the door. I'm going to head out, I said. Julia stood. She crossed the room, and she did something she hadn't done when I arrived, something I hadn't expected. She hugged me, not the brief, performative contact of Christmas Eve. She put her arms around me and held on, and after a moment, I put my arms around her too. Come in the spring, she said against my shoulder. We'll figure out where I'm living by then. Come and see it. I will, I said. Miley hugged me next, quickly, fiercely. Jack, not wanting to be excluded, grabbed my knee. Bye, he announced. Bye, Jack. I picked up my bag. I opened the door to the cold morning air. The first morning in 4 days without a blizzard, the world outside washed clean and white and bright, the mountains standing in full clarity against a sky that had spent itself and was now simply wholly blue. Cole was waiting with the car. I walked to it. On the drive to the airport, I opened my phone and found the photograph. It was a summer photograph. My father and I at the cabin 10 years ago or more. He was standing at the end of the dock in old fishing clothes, holding a rod, squinting into the morning sun. I was beside him, doing the same, my posture a younger version of his without either of us having planned it. We had the same way of standing with our weight slightly back, slightly patient, waiting for whatever was going to happen without forcing it. The cabin was behind us, small, weathered, entirely itself, a building that had never pretended to be anything other than what it was. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I opened a message to Nathan. Spring trip to the cabin, block off a week in April, and start the preliminary research on the Tokyo acquisition. I want to be on the ground there within the month. His response came quickly. On it. And Emma, for what it's worth. He would have loved to see today. I looked out the window at the mountains, white and enormous and permanent, the kind of thing that exists on a timescale that makes most human dramas feel temporary, which they are, which is somehow both humbling and relieving. I thought about my father sitting in that chair by the fire. I thought about the way he used to hold his coffee mug with both hands in the morning, taking inventory of what he had. I thought, I have this. I have the cabin and the work and the spring and maybe, slowly, carefully, I have my family back. The car pulled onto the highway heading east. The mountains began to recede behind me, vast and quiet in the rearview mirror. I watched them until I couldn't see them anymore. Then I turned around and looked at the road ahead. There is something my father used to say that I didn't fully understand until I was old enough to have things I was afraid to lose. He said, "The people who underestimate you are giving you a gift. They're showing you exactly how much room you have to move." For 6 years, my family gave me that gift. All that room, all that invisibility, all that low expectation that created the space in which I could build something real. I didn't do it to hurt them. I want to be clear about that. I did it because my father built something worth protecting, and I was the only one who understood what protecting it actually required. Not performance, not appearances, not the expensive hollow theater of wealth signaling to other wealth, just the work. Steady, invisible, accumulating. Emma Reed was the black sheep. The black sheep was the wolf, and the wolf had been watching, the whole time, from the end of the table. Thank you for staying with me through Emma's story. If this reached something in you, if you've ever been the one at the far end of the table, the one handed the invoice instead of the gift, the one told that your silence was weakness when it was actually strategy, then this story was for you. Every single comment you leave, I read. Every city you drop in the comments becomes part of the map of how far a story can travel when it tells the truth. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. There are more stories like this one. Stories about quiet people who knew exactly what they were doing all along. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You probably already know who that person is. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.